All right, welcome everyone to the webinar. I'm going to give folks just a few seconds to kind of make their way in, and then we will go ahead and get started. Thank you to everyone who has just joined. I'm giving folks just a second to make their way in, and then we will go ahead and get started. Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the second session of the Virtual National Adaptation Forum series, Responding to Climate Amplified Extreme Weather Events. My name is Carrie Schaefer, and I am the project coordinator for the National Adaptation Forum. I'm going to give just a brief introduction here in the beginning, and then we will go ahead and get started with our session. To begin, I'd like to thank our sponsor, the CO2 Foundation, for supporting this series. The CO2 Foundation supports nonprofit organizations and individuals who seek to disrupt the causes and consequences of a rapidly changing climate. I encourage you all to visit their website and learn more about the great work that they are doing. For this session and the rest of the series, we are going to be using GoToWebinar, so I wanted to take a moment to orient you all with the software itself. We will have plenty of time at the end of this session to ask questions. If you do have a question, you can put it in the question tab here on the side. Also at the bottom of your screen, you'll see kind of 4 arrows pointing inward. This will allow you to expand your window into full screen mode. Your setup might actually look something more like this if you are in the desktop version, but those same features are still there. So you'll see the full screen button is in that top panel, and then the questions is kind of a drop-down tab. So feel free to ask questions as they come up. And I wanted to note that this is just one session of a 4-part series that is taking place throughout April and May. So if you registered for this event, you are automatically registered to attend the remaining 2 sessions in the series. The first session happened 2 weeks ago. You can find a recording of that at our website, which is nationaladaptationforum.org. All of these sessions will be recorded and posted to our website following the event. Generally, I'm able to get those recordings up there within a day or 2, so just hang tight as we get them processed. And with that, I would like to introduce our panel of speakers today. So first up, we have Matthew Topper. So after working in the social sector of disaster response for 18 years, Topper knows the good, the bad, and the ugly of what it takes to get survivors back home. He has worked with hundreds of organizations at the tactical, operational, and strategic levels of disaster recovery. Tired of the field coming at varsity level problems with only JV solutions, Topper launched Stormwise Foundation in 2021 to influence a paradigm shift in the disaster space. He and his team use an educational model to equip community leaders with disaster solutions so they can lead through crises at the varsity level. He is most active on the Stormwise Foundation Facebook page, where he posts frequent on-location videos, but you can also get nitty-gritty details at stormwisefoundation.org. Welcome, Matthew. Next, we have Dr. Joshua Baer. Joshua is a research professor at the Virginia Modeling, Analysis, and Simulation Center at Old Dominion University, and a program manager at the Institute for Coastal Adaptation and Resilience. Currently, he is deploying a housing recovery platform that speeds the housing repair times of displaced, vulnerable, and medically fragile households by way of allowing for better coordination and situational awareness across nonprofits and faith-based recovery organizations. Welcome, Joshua.
Thank you.
Next up, we have Kate Burns. Kate serves as the executive director for Metro Lab. She has worked for 2 mayors over the span of nearly 6 years. She was the technology policy advisor for Mayor Jenny Durkin in Seattle, Washington, And before moving to Seattle, she was the Innovation Policy Advisor for Mayor Sly James in Kansas City, Missouri. Currently, she serves as the Principal Investigator for 2 NSF awards, helping shape and manage the Civic Innovation Challenge. She has a law degree from the University of Missouri, Kansas City, and a BS in journalism from the University of Kansas. Welcome, Kate. Next, we have Saurabh Kulkarni. Saurabh is a licensed professional engineer in Virginia, has experience developing hydrologic and hydraulic models for flood forecasting. He is the founder of Analogy Plus, a software development company that specializes in building software products for startups focused on disaster preparedness, response, and recovery. And that is where he's worked for the past decade. Welcome, Saurabh. And last but certainly not least is Brandon Callahan. Brandon is a Marine Corps veteran and manager of rebuild operations for Team Rubicon, a veteran-led disaster response organization. A North Georgia native, Brandon joined Team Rubicon in 2015 and has served in just about every capacity ever since. Currently, he spearheads Team Rubicon's rebuild initiatives, including long-term programs in Texas, Alabama, Kentucky, Alaska, and Louisiana. Brandon spent 8 years in communications in the Marine Corps and is a graduate of both the Piedmont College School of Arts and Sciences and American University School of Public Affairs. Welcome, Brandon. All right, so that is all of our speakers. And with that, I am going to go ahead and kick off our questions. So the first thing I wanted to do as a way to kind of get to know the work that you all are doing a little bit more is just ask, can each of you tell me the role that you or your organization plays in facilitating housing recovery to disasters? And I'm just going to choose an order here based on my screen. So Topper, if you want to go first, then Joshua, Kate, Saurabh, Brandon.
Yeah, certainly. So I've worked mostly in the long-term recovery part of disasters. I'd like to get more into preparation and relief, immediately after, but getting people back into houses has been a growing passion. So what we do at Stormwise Foundation is create platforms that make it really easy to work with local community leaders and national leadership of nonprofits that do the type of rebuilding necessary. So Brandon, I think you'll hear in a moment, represents an organization like that. So there's national groups and there's local groups, and they need to do this in order to get the houses rebuilt. So we facilitate this, and we do that through education. Some of the education is doing things relationally, and some of it is providing the tech tools to make it really easy.
Awesome. Once again, my name is Joshua Bear, and I'm a research professor, but in the last couple of years, we've spent a lot of energy in developing a housing recovery platform. It's called CEMA, Convergence Inventory Matching and Assignment Housing Recovery Platform. And similar to what Matthew just suggested, it's a ripe area to increase the level of coordination and situational awareness across the nonprofit, faith-based, and government entities that are in partnership in working on housing repair, making those repairs. So there's a lot of opportunities to better coordinate. And when you do that, you get people back into their homes sooner rather than later. You shorten that displacement time. And displacement's associated with a lot of bad things, pain, suffering, and reduced longevity. So the quicker you get people back in their homes, the better. And so as a research institution, we found that there is a ripe area need for better coordination. We set out to build that platform, and that platform is rolling out right now. So thank you.
Always tough to follow Joshua Bear. Hello, good afternoon, good morning, everyone. I'm Kate Burns. Thank you, Joshua and Carrie, for including me in this conversation. So I'm with Metro Lab. We are a nonprofit that focuses on equipping cities and counties with research and science. We believe in transformative partnerships between local communities and universities. So we aren't specifically housing focused, although it is a huge priority right now for local governments. We are more of experts with partnership and resourcing amazing ideas to make them actionable and into our community. So we have the privilege of helping the Civic Innovation Challenge, as Carrie mentioned. And what that does is it is a National Science Foundation program, also funded by DHS and FEMA, as well as Department of Energy, that brings financial opportunities to pilot deployment, one of which is SEMA, and is a hugely successful project that we are really excited to help sing the song about. Some other examples include a pilot that helped hyperlocal flooding sensors in New York City that were in low to moderate income communities, and it flips the insurance policy such that it measures the event itself and can immediately deploy funds, eliminating that 2 to 3 month wait for folks to wait on their insurance funds, which is hugely important when you're in low to moderate income communities. Some other projects within Civic are in the northern Midwest, updating flood maps using resident involvement, which are 20 to 30 years old and no longer relevant, which is really interesting in Michigan. And finally, in Florida, in Callahan County, where in the state of Florida, librarians are also required to be emergency providers in the event of a disaster. And so they are creating resiliency hubs, which I see as your next event, which is amazing. And in Calhoun County, they've used 25 libraries to become resiliency response resources. So it's delightful to be here and happy to speak on any sort of opportunities with respect and getting the good work, such as those of these panelists, in partnership and actionably into communities. So that's me.
Thank you, Kate. Hi, this is Rapul Tani here. I have been in this space for almost 15 years, but looking at things at a more macroscopic level, understanding flood risks on the eastern parts of the United States. And then last 10 years or so, I focused my attention more on building technologies that would really empathize with the humans using it. So what I realized is there was a lot of systems and technologies out there, but they didn't really prioritize the adoption that needs to take place. So for me, the biggest focus as I work with Dr. Bear on building this tool is how do we bring that human empathy as the first priority into any product and app platforms that we develop. So in a way, I build technologies, but my priority is technology is not the solution. It can facilitate things, but it needs to focus on adoption first. And that's what we do at Energy Plus is focus on what we build, how we build it. Those are solved problems, but what do we exactly build? How do people actually use it? Are we adding more burden when we build any piece of technology, and making sure that whatever we do is like the priority is adoption, adoption, adoption.
All right, I'll go. Thank you. So again, I'm Brandon Callahan. Joshua, appreciate the invite. Carrie, thank you for having me. Team Rubicon is a veteran-led humanitarian organization that serves global communities before, during, and after both natural disasters and humanitarian crises. In its 13-year history, Team Rubicon's launched over 1,100 operations domestically and internationally in response to those disasters and crises. For our rebuild program specifically, which is the part of Team Rubicon that focuses on housing and the effort that I manage day to day and run day to day, we specifically work inside that housing recovery space. We focus on rebuilding disaster affected communities, specifically with more resilient and sustainable techniques and practices, with our ultimate end goal being that we're able to make our clients weather future storms and stop reinvesting in the same areas that don't get the attention they need in the first place. A shorter way, I guess, is we're boots on the ground assistance before, during, and after these storms.
All right, thank you everyone for those great overviews. So The next question I wanted to dive into, and I know all of you said this could be an entire webinar on its own, so I'm eager to hear your thoughts, is what are the biggest barriers in facilitating housing recovery? And I'd love to get some insight, kind of both recovery in the short term, but also in the long term. And whoever wants to speak on this first, feel free to go. Let me know if you would prefer I choose an order for you all to go.
I'm happy to go first again. You know, I hate choosing such a banal topic, but I'd say money in the short term. It's like kind of obvious, right? But for those of you who may not know what happens after disasters that make it onto your news cycle, which is usually some pretty bad stuff. Sometimes the news cycle is barren and they'll report on a smaller disaster. But if it's big enough for you to hear about it, it will probably be years before those people get back into their houses for all types of monetary reasons, whether they don't have enough, their 401k wasn't big enough, the insurance check didn't cover it, FEMA didn't cover it, or any community development block grant didn't affect it. It's all just so slow to get out that if you think about your roof getting torn off, is your house going to be worth anything in a year? You know, it's going to all go downhill. So the faster the money gets out, the better. That's the short term. The long term, I would cater to kind of what the mission of Stormwise Foundation is in answering it. I'd say homegrown recovery models. So again, if you're not aware, typically the further that you get away from a disaster striking, the less help there is. It's just a really steep decline in any type of people, whether you're going to pay them or not pay them as volunteers. There's going to be less people that do the actual work. And so we help to build those systems to keep people engaged at all levels, right? Whether you're in the social sector, which is nonprofits, public-private sector, there's different ways to engage those sectors to like keep the pressure on so we keep this momentum going. So homegrown, I say that because I think it's best that a disaster affected community leads their own recovery. The opposite of that would be the American Red Cross, who is huge, a massive organization, and they do actually have the money and the people to show up and like do everything for you. They won't because, you know, they're spread thin over lots of different countries, but there's the we'll move in and take over, or we empower the people who are there. So that's a contrast I'm drawing, and I'm saying do it from the homegrown level. Anyone else?
Oh, I'll jump on that.
Go ahead.
Okay, yeah. I actually had the same short-term answer there, which is money. There's a million things more important than money, but they all cost money. And with the current state of disaster response and the access to those resources available to survivors right now, money's it. Longer term for me is where my head starts to almost explode with that, because I don't know about a webinar. I could teach at least a semester long course just on barriers and housing recovery, and everybody on this call could, and we wouldn't even talk about the same things. Like, it's such a complex beast to look at. I mean, we could look at legislation, the state of volunteerism, the state of philanthropy, the interaction between local, municipal, state, federal entities. Like, the list is endless, unfortunately. But for me, I think it comes down to, and this is probably biased from my role and what I do now, but it comes down to such a slow, I think the biggest barrier right now, long term, is the slow adaptation of modern construction, building sciences and methods. We've largely built houses the same way for 100 years, while there's been a technological revolution in every other field. Look at the state of aircraft 100 years ago. I just came back from a deployment literally yesterday where I was rebuilding a house that was framed in 1921. And some of my apprentices that were with me were shocked to see that it's the same fasteners, the same framing styles, the same, like they knew how to navigate it. That doesn't work for me. I think the whole space, every sector on it has got to do better. The technologies exist, but one way or another, it all distills back to a short-term cost problem. When you start talking about upgrades to buildings, well, that sounds expensive for home builders. Maybe they won't recoup their losses. Like the whole space there, the technology exists right now to build houses that never have to be built again. That's a big long-term barrier to me. There's no reason why we shouldn't all be doing that. So much of the space is trying to go in that direction, but there's even a lot of barriers that stop that. So it took me days to come up with just one. So we'll go with that one before I just talk myself into a rabbit hole for the next hour.
Well, I would build upon both what Matthew and Brandon have said, and I'd say in a post-event environment, the rules have changed. The rules that govern how you go about service delivery are markedly different. So in that environment, you have a traumatized population. You have a traumatized physical environment. People have suffered loss in terms of their property and the contents of their homes. Those contents are close and dear to them, and that's traumatic. The environment around them is altered. The community's been things that seem so permanent. The store on the corner, those type of, there's a lot of devastation. A lot of people have suffered acute injury and death. So if not within that household, maybe within that household, there hasn't been a person that has suffered acute injury and death, but certainly that household knows of a neighbor that has suffered acute injury and death. So the matching of resources that come in, money and people and assistance and nonprofits and government, all those resources flowing into that impacted area need to match up or get connected to the needs of those impacted populations and communities. And under normal blue sky environment, there's rules that govern the connection of A with B. How do you get those services to the people in need? But it's an altered environment in that post-event environment and the recovery environment that makes it much more complex and difficult. People with a need don't necessarily know how to or have the means, the capability to raise their hand and say, I have a need, this is what the need is. I mean, it's much magnitude more complicated. And that's what I would add, similar to what Brandon and Matthew said.
I would go off of also just that from my perspective that sometimes in local governments there are policy black holes in which, you know, in department world these things just don't fit. For an example is that, you know, when it's hot outside crime goes up because people are agitated. But your parks department who builds your pools is not thinking about crime, and your police are not thinking about pools. Similarly, offices of emergency management in cities are thinking about, you know, really short-term or, you know, specific event planning. But the rest of your, like, housing departments in cities are not thinking about disasters. They're thinking about their housing stock. And so oftentimes states or counties are the, you know, recipients of funds or plans to rebuild, but they don't know the community like the on the ground municipality. And so that's why the work of like these panelists are so important to get resources on the ground that know the community right there, because oftentimes this sort of work is just not owned by anyone at the local government level.
Thank you. Wow, the scale of the problem is just so immense. And when I think about it and just hearing Matthew talk about homegrown recovery and when Brandon is talking about the technologies that are already available and Josh saying like the need for these matching of inventory, what comes to mind for me is the notion that what are the data sharing policies in place right now where we can learn from what is already working. And because there is so much that we could be thinking about in terms of learning faster. I think right now the learning is happening, but I think it's probably not happening at the pace at which it could be happening if we thought about the learning, because that continuous learning and evolution from that is such a critical aspect of creating a better situation. For example, how are two communities different? How are they organized differently? And how these departments how these emergency management departments within certain counties, if they're organized differently, are they creating a better recovery posture than the ones that are not? And if we could learn from them and even reorganize these departments to better facilitate that long-term recovery. So I think there's a lot of, for me, it's like from a technology perspective, it's like, how can we build systems that can learn from what is already out there and continue to evolve from those learnings? So the data sharing becomes a big piece for me.
Okay, thank you all. Any other thoughts on this question about barriers?
We could probably all go like another round or two.
Yeah.
We don't want that.
Yes, and this is the group that is working to address those barriers. So hopefully, you know, into this conversation, we'll also be getting to some of those solutions and how you all are addressing those barriers. And you already kind of heard some of that in those intros as well. So the next thing I wanted to get into kind of deals with the unequal impacts of extreme weather events. So as I'm sure you know, many of our audience members are aware, extreme weather does not impact all communities equally. So due to racist housing policies like redlining, communities of color are often located in flood-prone areas, making them more vulnerable to extreme weather events. In addition, communities of color, along with low income and medically vulnerable populations, often lack resources to evacuate and can face immense barriers to recovery due to limited household or community resources. So what I wanted to ask you all is, what can be done to make sure that recovery is equitable? And are you all kind of thinking about addressing those underlying issues that cause these inequities in the first place?
Well, I'll jump in. So I think the equity and justice issues that underline recovery are just so fundamental and huge. We have disparities currently. I don't think there's, I can't think of an urban area where we don't have disparities. We have disparities in health, well-being, lifespan longevity, education attainment, opportunities in terms of jobs, income, health, well-being. You go across the board. And we've made tremendous strides in the last couple of decades in most of our communities in narrowing some of those disparities. But the disparities in large measure are still chasms. They're not just gaps or differences. They're still very, very large. And what we see happening repeatedly in the U.S. Is over time, those disparities are getting more narrow, but then an event punctuates the environment. We have a catastrophic event, a storm or tornado or something like that, that has a lot of physical damage to the infrastructure and the housing. And Carrie said it, the recoveries are not equal in any stretch of the imagination. They're very, very unequal. And what we see following an event, if you look at the years, months, years out following an event, the narrowing disparities in an urban area often become exacerbated by that event. And then in the years following, they start to narrow again. And it's not just, 6 months later, a year later, 2 years later, you're back to where you were pre-event. You're pre-event normal again. It takes decades to reach back to the disparities you had pre-event. So in a sense, it sets you back a little bit. And I think we have the knowledge, we have the awareness, we have the tools, we have the technology, we have the resources, we have a lot of different things at our disposal under blue skies. And we know that there's disparities that exist today, and we know they're exacerbated by storms, and we know it takes a long time to get them back to pre-event. What can we do today ahead of time under blue skies to try and prepare for that and mitigate that, lessen that exacerbation and disparities that happens following an event? And I think we're obligated to do a better job at thinking that through and planning for it and taking action. And I think that motivates me. I've always used this phrase with others, nothing holier than a convert. And when I actually started documenting and looking at current disparities and tracing how those disparities, like chasms, even become larger after an event, takes when I saw that, I was it's almost unconscionable that we're not doing more as a nation to try and prepare for those recoveries. Anyway, I'll get off my soapbox. Thanks.
I don't like to follow Joshua there, but I'll take a swing at it. This one for me was just as hard as trying to go through the barriers question. I spent just as long going back and forth on the question itself about the barriers, because even the ones listed here don't even start to touch it. One of the biggest inequities we see in the part of the space I'm in, for example, is the lack of access to any kind of support for renters, or more specifically, the lack of access for support to preserve homeownership to stop them from becoming renters because their home was destroyed. But that's just one piece of it. I think the first part, I have a 3-part plug here for what we can do, at least from my perspective, to try to be more equitable in the space. The first is look broadly. Everybody on this call at some point is guilty of it. And if you work in this space, it's a hard thing to do, but that is stop looking just at major cities. That excludes almost half the population of the United States. Rural areas face their own unique challenges with it, including lack of media attention, lack of that money we talked about, and lack of just resources to recover in general. So we have to look broadly. We can't just look to solve in urban settings where all the infrastructure is on our side. Second is that resilience plug I talked about earlier. I won't rehash the resilience part of it, but the biggest part for me on equity here is looking at preventing conversion into renters. Out of the clients I've seen in the last 3 years, specifically, the vast majority of them, more than 70%, are homeowners of a home that has been passed down over multiple generations. The mortgage has long since been paid. A disaster strikes. Now they can't live there anymore. So we're converting homeowners to renters because they can't afford to fix their house, right? So arming those survivors with the tools to weather future storms, be it construction science all the way to education and preparedness, that's a big plug for me. And then third, I think this is the most important, so I'll close with it. This is the most important thing I see is community level and survivor agency and autonomy, that every person in the disaster response space has to pay heed to and do better with. There's a saying I've heard a lot in this space that if you've seen 27 disasters, you've seen 27 disasters, but you don't know shit about the next one. And that's something that people need to hold on to, all right? The longer we work inside the same space, the more prone we are to go, oh, I worked a tornado, I know how to recover this community, and you don't. That community and those survivors have to have their own agency and own autonomy for that. It's something that especially large national organizations like mine have to be super mindful of, because we have done this a lot. I rattled it off earlier. We've done this 1,100 times in 13 years. That doesn't mean we know what this next community needs, what those survivors need, or how to get to the right answer for them.
That's a great lead in for me. Thank you, Brandon. Yeah, every disaster is unique, and I'm not sure if, I think it might be a common misunderstanding, misperception, misallocation for people watching that, like there's somebody in government locally who's got like a play-by-play plan for what to do when bad stuff happens. And at some level, I don't want to ditch on EMA people too bad, but like, as you might expect, if that was your job, you're going to do your job in your own silo, your friends, your influences, and when you get to the end of that, you're done, right? But you may have left out like vast populations of people that you live around, and those people may have come up with their own plan and not told the other people about it, right? And so breaking down silos is very much linked to equity, which is what you were talking about, you know, to frame the question. And that also typically happens, even though it's 2023, along racial lines. In the South, there are still racially divided neighborhoods, which wouldn't necessarily be enforced, but it's just where people have ended up living geographically separate from each other. So my point is that it takes a little bit of intelligent outside influence to say, hey, is everyone at the table that should be at the table before we start making plans, you know? And I'll tell you that by and large in this country, we speak English, but these silos do not communicate. That there are vastly different languages and perspectives and priorities and obligations of each silo. So you get some of these people talking together and they're just missing constantly. So it's not just do you get them in the room at the same table, but can you actually get them to communicate? And if you can do that at a very simple level, things will change. And so here's what I mean. To be communicative, you probably have to start out being humble, not common for Americans. So humility, very simple, but can open vast resources, right? If you're simple and you communicate, sorry, if you're humble and you communicate. Also, if you're thinking more community centric instead of self-centric, most people in disasters are kind of pushed into a corner and they go back to their primal, you know, state and get very defensive, and the worst part of their personality shows up for weeks, maybe months, especially those who are in leadership positions, under a lot of pressure, forced to make decisions, don't have the right information to make the decisions. People start acting maybe not on their best day for a long period of time, and that can isolate resources when you want to bring resources in. So changing the mindset to what do I need to what do we need, that's again a simple change, opens, you know, huge resources. So one of the benefits that I've seen at Stormwise Foundation is being somebody who doesn't have a dog in the fight. Going into the fight, I can just ask the dumb question. I can be like, okay, who should I talk to, instead of you know, being seen as siding with this one or siding with that one. I can be somewhat neutral to influence the conversation, and I can be wrong, I can be offensive, and I can, you know, I can be given some grace for that, whereas other people really have a lot to risk. Now, the benefit of disasters, and it's hard to talk in terms like that because you don't want disasters, right? But a lot of those walls come down when people realize this is all way beyond our abilities. We have to work together. We have to figure it out. They become more willing to be humble, communicate, be community centric instead of self-centered. And I've seen just unbelievable things happen where racial reconciliation happens, or a Protestant Catholic divide is eroded, and you see a real strength of community built out of the rubble. So there's kind of a cultural fabric that's reinforced from what was a dire situation. So it isn't just pie in the sky. Oh, that sounds idealistic. He's dreaming. I can point back to multiple communities that I've worked in where that's happened, and it's a beautiful thing. So I am hopeful about addressing some of those things. I hate that it would have to happen because of a hurricane or a tornado, but like, let's make the best of it. If it does happen, let's bring down some walls.
Kate or Sarab, anything to add there?
I would just add, as someone who brings in partners and funding, to further sort of expertise and the feedback that we've heard already, I think that a conversation in these projects has to be equity from the start, including the recognition of the historical disinvestment that where the community is now before the event, to Brandon's point, to make sure that before and after bring that equity conversation into place. So I think real intentional work of bringing in the voice of the residents, particularly those of underinvested communities, is really important through all phases. So, and echoing what everyone else said.
Yeah, I think hearing Matthew just frame it in a more optimistic way was amazing to just hear that. I see it as this, from an equity standpoint, when I think about it, it's this idea of belonging that needs to become front and center, because ultimately it's a partnership. The state can only do so much, or the local government can only do so much. So bringing that sense of like, what's that individual responsibility there? And then how do we get that individual buy-in, or even the community buy-in? And if the community hasn't been involved before, like how do you actually give that sense of belonging? Because who is there at the table but feel like they belong and their perspectives matter? Like, I think that's where my mind goes as I think about these things. Is like, it's fundamentally, it starts with, I am this community, I'm part of this.
So I would be interested to know from you all. I mean, we've been kind of talking about this in the abstract sense, but do you all have examples of communities that are tackling housing recovery in a good way, in an equitable way? And are there kind of like lessons that we can take from those communities to apply elsewhere? Or on the flip side
Can
of
I
that,
plug?
yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead, Carrie.
Plug something. I was going to say on the flip side of that, no need to call it a specific community, but if there's something you've seen where you say like, this is very commonplace that a lot of communities are doing, but maybe this is not the way we should be doing things. So I'll kind of present both sides of that to you.
I was just going to plug SEMA. I don't know, Joshua's and Saurabh's work on this program is really, really fantastic, and it brings in the human element of recovery. So I don't know, Joshua, if you could talk about that a little bit more, but it's a really great project that states from around the country are looking at.
Yeah, I don't want to spend too much time talking about plugging SEMA. I appreciate that, but the platform's pretty close to go, and what we need right now is we need to do some field testing with it and actually get it out in the field. You can do stress tests with artificial data. You can bring in some data, some real world recoveries to test it, but at this point it's available. We need to test it in the field. So I would leave it at that. Matthew and Brandon have a lot more boots on the ground in the trenches experience to be able to compare and contrast across different communities. So I'll defer to them, but thank you.
I'll jump. Yeah. Thought about this one a lot too, leading up to this, because yeah, I have a lot of experience on the ground. Matthew does, but that doesn't make me. It probably makes me more hesitant to want to call out any specific communities or entities for what they do well and don't, because this space is so nuanced. If you actually approach that recovery as an individual and community level of it, it gets so nuanced. So I was thinking through some of the themes I see in Matthew actually kind of hit on the theme a minute ago when he said, you know, there seems to be this misconception that there's somebody in government with a playbook of what we're going to do this, and they got it. And when the disaster happens and that doesn't happen, we're already upset because we expected that. Well, to compound on that, the vast majority of the heavy lifting done after a recovery and the coordination of it is done almost exclusively by volunteers who have never done this before. They're called long-term recovery groups, long-term recovery committees, long-term recovery councils, some variation thereof. And it's folks that are active in their community. They might be small business owners, they might be parents, they might be realtors who say, yeah, I'll do it. What am I doing? And they're just people in that community doing the best they can. There are resources available for them to use, assuming that those resources end up matched up. Plug for SEMA over there, but it's hard. Like, even that is largely what makes it for me so hard to compare community to community recovery, because no two disasters are the same, no two recoveries are the same, and they're spearheaded by people in their local communities. But I think the biggest takeaway for me from that is that education around the space, the places that I've seen where there's education about that process, what this looks like, who's going to do it, who's on this long-term recovery committee, what resources do we have right out the gate. Like open, transparent, and honest communication about the education of the recovery process as best we can. I've seen really good results from that, even when people are given unfavorable answers, because they at least knew what was going on. As opposed to recoveries that are ran largely in the dark, and we have this ubiquitous they out there somewhere who decides who gets help and who doesn't and whatever else.
So again, I think Brandon and I we're kind of complimenting one another. Appreciate that, Brandon. I'll send you the check. So one of the things about technology, at least most IT, is that it is by nature very equitable, because pretty much, you know, everyone's got one of these, right? And you can do so much on a phone that it doesn't matter anymore what kind of strata you come from in the society or what kind of prejudices you are. You have a lot of ability just in the palm of your hand. So what we focus on at Stormwise Foundation is crafting a trajectory for community leaders that would bring them more onto the same playing field of other groups and other entities in the same community, whether it's a town or a region. You want to promote people working together, and technology is a way to do that. It's a way, it's not the one way. We're not trying to force people into a cookie cutter solution for the reasons that Brandon just said, right? Like every disaster is different and you have to respect that. So in being adaptable through technology, you can craft a custom solution that empowers local community leaders in ways that they weren't previously. Now, just the fact that you might have been through a disaster before and you're willing to be in relationship with somebody who hasn't, that's empowering. But if you couple that with other tools that are IT based, you can really ramp up somebody's status as it's seen in the community as a mover and a shaker. If you get two people like that to work together, and maybe 3 and 5, and you create a coalition of people, that becomes equity where there wasn't equity before. And so long as, you know, the community is proportionally represented in some type of leadership format like that, then you have a chance of the walls that have broken down would stay broken down, and other walls, you know, maybe would get built up. So a lot of the work that we do is introducing technology with a mind towards the humanity behind it, right? So to talk about what Brandon was just referencing, the long-term recovery groups, these are supposed to be equitably, you know, created groups of people from the community that want to work together. But a lot of times, even if it's a small town, these people have never met each other, right? And suddenly you got to start agreeing on budgets and who gets the money. It can get really rough, right? So technology doesn't automatically solve that, doesn't make that equitable. You have to, most of the work that we do in those situations is, okay, identifying who's protecting what asset, who's concerned about what obligation, how do we broker trust between people, being the outside person. Maybe AI could do that someday. For now, it's a very relational position to be in. So it's a balance. You got to have the tools and you got to have the relationships to craft something for that particular community so that it is equitable. And like I said, I've seen it. I've been used to be part of it, so I'm grateful for that. But it's work, and especially if you're going to do it on the front end before disaster, there's no urgency. You know, people are busy, they got meetings. What are they going to talk to you about that for, right? So that's the real heavy lifting, is to do it in a preparedness kind of way. Unfortunately, a lot of times you have to wait till something bad happens, or you could capitalize on a near miss, right? Like the community that was in the cone but didn't get hit, or the tornado hit next door but not them. You might be able to, you know, get some work done there, but otherwise it's a long road.
Rob, I would love to bring you in on this. I mean, I know in terms of barriers, you kind of talked about the need for data sharing, standardization. I don't know if you have thoughts on this in terms of like, are there groups who are already doing this well, or kind of lessons we can learn in order to kind of, you know, facilitate some of this data sharing, bring in some of these aspects of technology?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of things that come to mind because I've been working with a charter school network in California, and it's about 40 schools throughout California with big focus around equity, and we've built tools for them to engage families in their students' like education. You know, like how do you create a partnership with where families really take ownership of their kids' education, and how do we make those things equitable? So as I think about one of the ways I'm thinking about is how can we take these like cross-domain knowledge and bring it into this context? Because right now engagement, even there are equity issues there, and there are tools being developed and family engagement happening there. How can we actually bring some of the lessons there into this context? So yes, people are not thinking about disasters, but they are thinking about education. Could schools be this point where families are already coming? Like, could they be the point for increased awareness around these things? So how can we actually use these, you know, almost like get domain knowledge from some other domain and bring it into this? Because ultimately it's about education, it's about awareness, it's about getting people's buy-in. And for me, it's like, it's very hard for someone to say like, hey, you know, you start participating in this disaster activity. Instead, like, could you actually meet them where they are? Most likely if they're going to schools, approach them there, get them where they're already at, and then from there you can shift their focus to something else. But that's how I see, like, there are tools being developed already across the US in terms of family engagement for schools. I believe there is something to be learned from that experience.
Anything else that our panelists want to add to this?
Yeah, I'm going to chime in here. Just a thought. Years ago, when we started thinking about evacuation and sheltering and how storms would unfold, we received some federal money from HUD, and that set us on a research track. And the premise that we operated on for many years was, and the people on this panel know because I've shared this with them before, but the premise that we operated on was, what can governments do to help speed housing recovery, essentially? What can governments do? And so we set out to try and document best practices, policies, practices, cultures within government, arrangements, whatever it might be, to have an inventory of what practices or policies were most correlated with facilitating a rapid recovery. And some people say it's oxymoron to even call it rapid recovery, but would speed a more quick recovery. And you know, we spent I don't want to say I'm ashamed to say it, but we spent a lot of taxpayer money trying to figure this out. And after years of working at it, we started to question the premise, because we did a lot of modeling and modeled different storms and different population groups and different built environment impacts, and looked at the recovery curves and did all this you know, stuff people do in universities. And we realized that the recovery curves weren't changing very much for some of the most vulnerable populations. When we tested out our market basket full of different potential government interventions, policies, or practices, it just didn't make much of a difference. But after okay, I'm a little slow, but it took me our team a couple of years to figure this out. We started questioning the premise. The premise was, what can governments do to speed housing recovery? And it was much more complex than that. And we realized after a while, the premise was wrong, because for most vulnerable, medically fragile households, Kate mentioned LMI households, for those households, government solutions or practices are farther downstream. You got bottlenecks with permitting or inspections or something like that. Well, for most vulnerable households that are displaced, you never hire a contractor, you never get an architect, you never get the finances, you never get to the permitting. So it doesn't care if you address that bottleneck by having more inspectors or permitters. That doesn't make a difference. You never get to that point. For the LMI households, the vulnerable households, the government solutions were farther downstream, and the real solutions that make a difference in speeding housing recovery for those populations that experience lengthy displacement times, those solutions really fall within the faith-based and nonprofit organizations and groups. When they work better and they coordinate better and they have better information, better resources, those type of things, that's when you see changes in the recovery curve of the most vulnerable populations. So I think there's a trajectory in our thinking and our realization. Now, the people with the boots on the ground, they knew this. It didn't take them a couple of years to figure this out, but it was a big shift in our thinking. That the premise is, what can we do from a team approach with the nonprofit, faith-based governments in that mix too? What can they do collectively together to speed housing recovery? It isn't just government solutions. This ties into Matthew saying there isn't just a single playbook out there that people believe there's this one government plan or something for recovery. It's not like that at all. That's my additional 2 cents.
All right, so before we get into questions from our audience, I want to give you all a chance to kind of just highlight, what is one point that you want the audience to take away from this session? I know we previously said keep this really short. We have a little bit of time before we end this session, so feel free to go a little bit longer. But we'll go in order here. So Matthew, Joshua, Kate, Sarab, Brandon. Let us know, what is your one point you want the audience to take away?
Thank you. Yeah, I'm going to go super analog here. I'm going to say be relational. That's what it boils down to, and that's so much maybe harder than it might appear, because I guess to some people, some just different personality types, it's easier than others, right? But even generationally, we're seeing differences in what relationship looks like, especially because of COVID. This format, right? Like, we're not in the same room. There's a distance that is kind of accepted now that was a little bit weird even 5 years ago, and we're bringing up a generation of people who don't know that this is for talking to people on. It's for texting, and they'll text somebody who's sitting next to them instead of talk to them. Eye contact is right out, right? So if you take that kind of interaction and then you introduce a disaster, like, it just erodes so quickly. If that's where you're starting from in your relational capabilities, your ability to facilitate resources like survival resources is greatly diminished. So I lived in Cambridge, Massachusetts, right? MIT, Harvard, smartest people in the world. They're going to go solve everything, right? I couldn't get anybody to say hi to me walking down the street, right? Like, how are these people going to be at like the UN? How is that going to go? Like, can you just practice being a decent human, and then when it like really gets hot and heavy, you have a chance of surviving? That's what I leave you with.
Okay, I had a thought, but I'm gonna change it now after listening to Matthew and Brandon, you in particular too mentioned something. Recovery is done largely by normal people, just everyday people, you and me. There's professional emergency management folks and et cetera, and there's trained people in that sense. But the majority of people that are linchpin to that recovery and effectuating, like making that recovery happen, are volunteers and first-time people, first time through an event like that, and they've been impacted too. And they've been traumatized too. So I'd say that my biggest takeaway, I would say, if I had to choose one today, I would say just to realize that those recoveries are on the backs, the weight's carried by just normal people, average people, like you and me.
I would say, and this is for the people who are listening who are working on solutions to the barriers. I would try and think like a mayor and think of other problems you can solve as you're thinking of solutions. So like with materials, affordable housing is a huge issue right now for mayors. And so if there's a way to develop materials, or as Brandon says, to build homes for affordable housing that creates more resiliency in a disaster event, like combining those issues are huge for communities right now. Similar when Greensburg, Kansas, my home state, had an F5 tornado, wrecked 95% of that community. They built it out without carbon emissions, and they're an entirely green city. Like climate change, also a huge issue when we're thinking about rebuilds. So I would just try and bring in as many priorities to local communities as possible, from building homes for people who need them, thinking about renters, thinking about that way in terms of how we think about everyday housing issues, to climate and transportation and getting access and mobility choices when you're thinking about rebuilds. That hits home so hard with local governments, and they are struggling for resources to combine all of these policy areas. So if you're either a researcher or institution who's thinking about solutions to give to your local government, it's helpful to think about it the same way that they would, or by cross-pollinating policy issues that you hope that your local government can consider to further their community priorities that are addressing these serious challenges. Saurabh, I think off to you.
Thank you. Yeah, I think for me the key emphasis, especially if like anyone who's local community official in that position of power, is to think about in terms of what are the tools for community collaboration that they could advocate for or even bring to bear. Because ultimately, I think it's the community that needs to really understand what they're up against, and government can play a role, but they're not gonna do everything. So I think, how can we get communities together? And technology is not a panacea, but it could help.
All right, you probably shouldn't have told me we had some extra time, but let's see what I can do here. No, there are two takeaways for me that are both kind of personal soapboxes for me, as well as professional bullet points and good takeaways. This one of my favorite things to remind everybody in every angle of this space of is it will happen to you at some point. I've done this not as long as some people on this call, or I'm sure listening or anything, over 10 years. With the exception of one community I've been to, one community, one time, I've never heard the phrase, yeah, this happens to us all the time. What I hear all the time is something like this has never happened here before. I could have never imagined this. Well, it's time to imagine it. It's becoming more and more dangerous to live on this planet. It will happen to you. It will happen to your family. It will happen to your community. Maybe it's just your house. Maybe it's your street. Maybe it's your whole city. Maybe it's your whole damn state. But it's going to happen. That sense of urgency has to exist in this space. It's not alarmist anymore to say, like, this is coming. We don't know what this is. Could be 5,000 small events in the next year. Could be, massive multiple state damage from some event. We don't know. But I want everybody on this call to think about it in that perspective. Like, we're all on the same team in the same fight when it comes to this, and that's a reality. The second part of it, I think, is that there's no one magic bullet for a key takeaway that'll change the space. But if there was one for me, it would be that this space drastically has to improve at getting diverse groups of people from all walks of life sitting at the same table and speaking the same language. I'm going to steal a quote from our Team Rubicon's co-founder and executive chairman, Jake Wood. He said, imagine if we all treated each other every day the way we did right after a disaster, when we're walking down the street, giving out food to our neighbors and trying to figure out what they need, people we may have never even known their name before. I'm sure everybody on this call has heard on September 12th, 2001, everybody was American. Everybody was on the same team. Well, why did it stop? And that's a personal challenge to every person sitting on this call, because the answer to that is us. That if we can do that, if that were my magic bullet and we treated each other that way every day, we'd actually be able to bring more of those people to the table, hear more of those marginalized voices that, because for whatever reason, we're not listening to in the past. I think that's number one. I think that's the best way to affect this space in specific. But number two, I think it's the way to break up what is a long-standing chain of learned indifference towards one another. And we are all on the same team. And if we can break that chain and start there, we can fundamentally change access, equitable access to housing recovery and disasters, affordable housing, all of it. We can solve all of those problems, but only when we're working together.
Thank you all for those very insightful comments. I'm going to turn us over to some questions from the audience, and then we will wrap up. So we have a lot of questions coming in from the audience. The first one that I wanted to pose to you all has to do with technology and social media. And so this person asked, you know, it seems like smartphones, social media, in a lot of ways has kind of diluted our coherence as, you know, a community over the past 10 or so years. So can any of you talk about times where phones or social media were either neutral or, you know, positive and fostered that civic commitment as it relates to housing recovery and resilience kind of more broadly?
I can.
Go ahead.
Unsurprisingly. So like I said, everyone's got one of these, right? Except for a lot of the aging community is maybe tech phobic. So they might have a flip phone or something, right? But their grandchild or their neighbor will. And FEMA has gone to, in some areas, all electronic application submissions. So you've just cut out all the aging population that's uncomfortable with these, right? That is not equitable. However, it can become a tool for you know, someone who's in a position of access to that person. That person, many times people are also they retreat into themselves after a disaster, become very defensive and suspicious of outsiders. And lots of people who come to, you know, be helpful are outsiders. And so if you give them access through this thing, instead of having to have a conversation with an outsider, they can keep their standards. They can say, you know, I'm still, I'll pick on Kentucky. Kentucky is very hyper local and even county to county, and wouldn't take help from the next county, right? But if you give them help through this, then, you know, maybe it's acceptable.
I might add some specific examples during my time in Seattle. This was right after like a horrendous, and this is awful because there's so many fires in California, horrendous fires around LA. And Twitter for the first time had a default sort of setting for people who were geofenced within an affected area, immediate sort of feeds for that. In Seattle, we were taking down a viaduct that was going to shut down 90,000 cars a day and had to redirect all of that traffic into the city for about 4 weeks while we were connecting a new underground highway. And this was for an earthquake vulnerable infrastructure. And so Twitter, for the second time in its history, worked with the city to develop a feed that we, oh my gosh, what was that project called? I can't remember. We named it and told people how to basically get around during this sort of event. So that was a really interesting project. Whether or not Twitter would do that again, I don't know. But at the time, on the flip side, we worked with OEM to develop sort of communication plans and a hyper-local response to events, considering trust with the government. So if the community was impacted and needed to report damage or needed help, how would sort of lack of trust with reporting with the local government impact that? As well as lack of ability if communications were down, if no power, no LTE or phone connectivity. How could they report that? So those were some really interesting ways that we were trying to utilize social media to respond to things in a hyperlocal way.
I have a couple of examples. Like the one example I have is, I think, yes, I mean, in normal times, I think people's priorities are scattered all over the place, you know, and I think social media can become a toxic pole. But I think in times of disasters where suddenly your priorities are straight now, like you're focused. One example I can cite is right after the Haiti earthquake, and I was living in Washington, D.C. then, there was a massive call to action via social media, and there were thousands of volunteers that came together to do a mapping, and I was part of that group, and we did develop a lot of maps for Haiti. And so the way I see it is, I think social media has value, and I think in a way, like some of the best aspects of it can be emphasized during that times of crisis. You know, so yeah, I think in normal times when we don't have this, it's harder. But I think even during then, like it could be used as a tool for awareness. I think there are a lot of mechanisms right now where I think, as Josh had mentioned earlier, around what can we do for during blue skies or for the preparedness phase. And I think social media can play a massive role in that. So given all its evils, I think it still could be used in a good way.
For what might be the first time in my life, I have nothing to add to what these guys said.
So our next question asks, oh, hold on, it just disappeared for me. Hold on, let me pull it back up. Are the panelists involving anthropologists and evaluators in their work? It says people in those who work in those fields can provide expertise on the ways to quickly understand and work with community dynamics, both in the short term and long term during response and recovery.
I can't help. I got to jump in right here real fast because I've gone to a lot of engineering conferences, informed and business type of conferences. My best conference that I've been to the last 3 years, I just got back from Cincinnati, is Society for Applied Anthropology. And I've met so many anthropologists. I've received more feedback, more thoughtful insight to the SEMA platform from anthropologists than any other discipline. I don't know if that was a planted question, Carrie, or how that came about. And just this morning, Christopher Dyer, I had a conversation with him this morning, a pretty eminent fellow. But anyway, the anthropologists have just been absolutely terrific.
Yeah, I'll back that up. I've never knocked on the door of somebody who has a degree in anthropology, but I have sought out the counsel of people in an anthropological sense as essential, the same way as Josh is saying. Man, it is so difficult to go into a new cultural geography blind. You might as well just keep your mouth shut and try not to stub your toe. But it can be. When I was starting in Lake Charles, I sought out a pillar of the Black community, and I had lunch with him, and I had one question that I wanted to ask. So I went through the whole lunch, and I was waiting for the right moment to ask the question. And at the end, I said, "What do I need to know?" And he just like rattled off all the things, right, that became absolutely essential for my inclusion and my adaptation into that community. So anthropology, fundamental.
That was a good question.
I'm glad that it set you up well. So we had a question about, some specific programs and whether or not you all have participated in them. So someone asked, have any of you facilitated or participated in emergency simulations, community resilience building, or other cooperative exercises? And are there lessons that you've learned there that you could share with this group?
Participated in quite a few exercises, often tabletop exercises. And we've surveyed, interviewed a lot of emergency management folks, state level, local folks across the nation. And we ask them in these interviews, when we're collecting data, we ask them how often they exercise for mid to longer term recovery. And the answer is it's pretty rare. They may have tabletop exercises that talk about longer term recovery, but it's not very effective or impactful. But yeah, exercising is really, really important. But I think there's a real blind spot that we don't exercise specifically for mid and longer term recovery. That's when you get the different social services, basically that's when you get those type of folks at the table. When you're focused on more of immediate response and logistics, immediate response and recovery, you get more of the professional emergency management type folks at the table.
I would definitely agree with that. I want to double down on that I've been to a few that focus on mid and long range recovery, but even the organizations and communities that were doing that, even if they obviously took it to heart, they were the ones organizing it, but there's little to no support around it, which is something we talked about earlier. So it largely ends up being ineffective in the recovery space that I've seen, not for the lack of trying, but for the lack of political capital usually to support that.
I participated in a few. I'd say I learned a lot actually, but the boil down takeaways would be tech will break and pressure changes people.
Yep.
Okay, so I think we'll wrap up with one final question. We had a question come in about funding and money. So certainly, I mean, Matthew, you started off saying that funding is a huge barrier to this work. Certainly more funding in this space would help. But I'm kind of interested in knowing, if the funding stays as it is, are there things that could be done to at least make sure that that funding is ending up where it needs to go, or move that funding along in, a bit of a faster way? Because we know that increased funding is not always an easy thing to come by. So how can we specifically, maybe remove some of those barriers that make accessing funding difficult?
I think that's my T-ball pitch there. That's worthy of a whole, webinar, but I'll try to be brief. So what I've said kind of continually over the years is that movement is magnetic. If you can generate movement on a project, really any project, I think, but in this case, getting people back into homes, if you can show that there is forward momentum, there's progress, you can build on that momentum and it draws funders into involvement, right? We have a ridiculous amount of monetary resources at our fingertips in this country, in all types of buckets, but no one's going to release, most people won't release their funds if it's just going to plateau, if it's just going to sit there. They need to see real dynamic change. So getting to that means you have to have some efficient systems. Just throwing more money or more people at a problem doesn't necessarily make it go better. Sometimes it makes it go worse. So it isn't just blindly doing something, but constantly iterating towards excellence would generate typically momentum. And that's what we do at Stormwise Foundation. We partner with community leaders so they can have that movement.
Any other thoughts on that point? Okay.
I'll take a real quick swing.
Yeah,
So,
go ahead.
There are so many, it's almost bureaucratic. There's so many strings attached. It's almost maddening, the length of time and the box that need to be checked before the funds actually reach the person in need or the community in need. And it's almost maddening. There's such a fear of loosening up the control or the process to manage those funds. The fear is that there's going to be some type of abuse of the money or misuse of the money. And so it's so tightly regulated, for lack of a better word. It's just maddening how long it takes, and it becomes, Matthew said at the very beginning, you know, you got a house with the roof off. It may take you 20 grand to make that home whole and get the people back. But if it sits there for a year and a half, and now the entire property is a complete loss, now you got $200,000 loss, and the household doesn't have those funds to rebuild and get back in. So it's maddening that slowness. So I think there needs to be a relaxation of some of the steps involved in getting the money to where it needs to be. And along with that, there will be some misuse or some abuse and inefficiency, I'm sure. But there's like almost being gun shy from the political point of view, the agency point of view, that if the money gets $500 for a hammer or something like that type thing, the reaction has over time been just to make it maddening how slow the process is. So I think there needs to be a loosening, but just an acceptance in a chaotic environment. There's going to be some misuse of certain money. That's a reality.
Okay, well, if there is nothing else, then I am going to go ahead and wrap us up. Thank you to our speakers for an amazing session. This was a really great discussion, and I feel like we could honestly keep discussing this all day. So I appreciate you all taking the time. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen again just to bring up this slide one last time. Oh, let's see, ended my presentation on accident. So I just want to remind everyone that there are 2 more sessions in this series. The next session will take place on May 3rd in 2 weeks. That will be focused on resilience hubs. And in addition, please keep an eye out for a post-series survey that will be sent out after the final May 17th session. And that really helps us to let us know what we're doing well, what we can improve upon, give us some feedback. So with that, I will wrap us up. Thank you for taking the time to come out today. Thank you again to our panelists, and I hope everyone has a great rest of their day.
Thank you.
Thank you.